April 22nd, 2025. Today is Earth Day, celebrated for the first time in 1970. The spark for the first Earth Day was the 1962 publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. A marine biologist and best-selling author, Carson showed the devastating effects of people on nature by documenting the effect of modern pesticides on the natural world. She focused on the popular pesticide DDT, which had been developed in 1939 and used to clear islands in the South Pacific of malaria-carrying mosquitoes during World War II. Deployed as an insect killer in the U.S. after the war, DDT was poisoning the natural food chain in American waters. DDT sprayed on vegetation washed into the oceans. It concentrated in fish, which were then eaten by birds of prey, especially ospreys. The DDT caused the birds to lay eggs with abnormally thin eggshells, so thin the eggs cracked in the nest when the parent birds tried to incubate them. And so the birds began to die off. Carson was unable to interest any publishing company in the story of DDT. Finally, frustrated at the popular lack of interest in the story behind the devastation of birds, she decided to write the story anyway, turning out a highly readable book with 55 pages of footnotes to make her case. When the New Yorker began to serialize Carson's book in June 1962, chemical company leaders were scathing. If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Miss Carson, an executive of the American Cyanamid Company said, we would return to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. Officers of Monsanto questioned Carson's sanity. But her portrait of the dangerous overuse of chemicals and their effect on living organisms caught readers' attention. They were willing to listen. Carson's book sold more than 500,000 copies in 24 countries. Democratic President John F. Kennedy asked the President's Science Advisory Committee to look into Carson's argument, and the committee vindicated her. Before she died of breast cancer in 1964, Carson noted, man's attitude toward nature is today critically important simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. We are challenged, as mankind has never been challenged before, to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. Meanwhile, a number of scientists followed up on Carson's argument and in 1967 organized the Environmental Defense Fund to protect the environment by lobbying for a ban on DDT. As they worked, Americans began to pay closer attention to human effects on the environment, especially after three crucial moments. First, on December 24, 1968, astronaut William Anders took a color picture of the Earth rising over the horizon of the Moon from outer space during the Apollo 8 mission, powerfully illustrating the beauty and isolation of the globe on which we all live. Then, over 10 days in January to February of 1969, a massive oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, poured between 80,000 and 100,000 barrels of oil into the Pacific, fouling 35 miles of California beaches and killing seabirds, dolphins, sea lions, and elephant seals. Public outrage ran so high that President Nixon himself, a Republican, went to Santa Barbara in March to see the cleanup efforts, telling the American public that the Santa Barbara incident has frankly touched the conscience of the American people. And then, in June 1969, the chemical contaminants that had been dumped into Cleveland's Cuyahoga River caught fire. A dumping ground for local heavy industry, the river had actually burned more than 10 times in the previous century. But with increased focus on environmental damage, this time the burning river garnered national attention. In February 1970, President Richard M. Nixon sent to Congress a special message on environmental quality. "We have too casually and too long abused our natural environment," he wrote. "The time has come when we can wait no longer to repair the damage already done and to establish new criteria to guide us in the future. The tasks that need doing require money, resolve, and ingenuity," Nixon said, "and they are too big to be done by government alone. They call for fundamentally new philosophies of land, air, and water use, for stricter regulation, for expanded government action, for greater citizen involvement, and for new programs to ensure that government, industry, and individuals are all called on to do their share of the job and to pay their share of the cost." Meanwhile, Gaylord Nelson, a Democratic senator from Wisconsin, visited the Santa Barbara oil spill and hoped to turn the same sort of enthusiasm people were bringing to protests against the Vietnam War to efforts to protect the environment. He announced a teach-in on college campuses, which soon grew into a wider movement across the country. Their Earth Day, held on April 22, 1970, brought more than 20 million Americans, 10% of the total population of the country at the time, to call for the nation to address the damage caused by 150 years of unregulated industrial development. The movement included members of all political parties, rich Americans and their poorer neighbors, people who lived in the city and those in the country, labor leaders and their employers. 55 years later, it is still one of the largest protests in American history. Today, the White House under President Donald J. Trump celebrated Earth Day by announcing that we finally have a president who follows science, with policies rooted in the belief that Americans are the best stewards of our vast natural resources. No green new scam required. One of the policies the White House champions is opening more federal lands and waters for oil, gas, and critical mineral extraction. 4 days ago, on April 18th, journalist Wes Seiler noted in his Wes Seiler's newsletter that the day before, Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum had signed an extraordinary order. The order assigned to the Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget, or ASPMB, control over the Department of the Interior, including its personnel and budget. Seiler explains that the person currently serving as ASPMB, which in normal times would require Senate confirmation, is DOGE operative Tyler Hassan, the CEO of a Houston-based energy company. Jennifer Rocalla, executive director of the nonpartisan Center for Western Priorities, said in a statement, "Elon Musk is now effectively in charge of America's public lands." Seiler notes that Burgum has handed power over the Department of the Interior to a hitherto unknown political operative who is holding his position in violation of the Appointments Clause of the Constitution. He also notes that the Department of the Interior manages the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Geological Survey, in addition to the National Park Service. As such, Seiler writes, Hassan is now responsible for 70,000 employees, the administration of numerous international treaties, the welfare of 574 Native American tribes, 433 national park sites, over 500 million acres of public lands, 700 million acres of subsurface minerals, and 3.2 billion acres of the outer continental shelf. Burgum's order says that his order is designed to effectuate the consolidation, unification, and optimization of administrative functions within the Department of the Interior in order to achieve effectiveness, accountability, and cost savings for the American taxpayer. In other words, he is falling back on the idea of further cuts to the U.S. government in order to save money. In fact, the public lands already make billions of dollars a year for the United States through tourism. But since the 1970s, the right wing has come to see the public ownership of lands as an affront to the idea that individuals should be able to use the resources they believe God has put there for them to use. Developers have encouraged that ideology, for privatization of Americans' Western lands has always meant that they ended up in the hands of a few wealthy individuals. That impulse shows in Project 2025. As Melinda Taylor, senior lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin Law School, told Bloomberg Law in November, Project 2025 is a wish list for the oil and gas and mining industries and private developers. It promotes opening up more of our federal land to energy development, rolling back protections on federal lands, and selling off more land to private developers. Burgum appears to be on board with that plan. On January 16th, in his confirmation hearings, Burgum made it clear that he sees selling the public lands as a source of revenue, referring to them as America's balance sheet. We've got $36 trillion in debt, he said, but we never talk about the assets, and the assets are the land and minerals. The Interior Department, he said, has got close to 500 million acres of surface. It's 700 million acres of subsurface and over 2 billion acres of offshore. That's the balance sheet of America. I believe we ought to have a deep inventory of all the assets in America. We ought to understand what is our assets, 100 trillion, 200 trillion? We could be in great shape as a country.
Letters from an American was written and read by Heather Cox Richardson. It was produced at Soundscape Productions, Dedham, Massachusetts. Recorded with music composed by Michael Moss.